We spoke about the importance of having a centralized config server to allow the dynamic services coming up and shutting down constantly have a central source to read from. It also allows us an easier management of configuration properties across microservices. We built the config server in our last video, SpringCloud config server. Please watch it to get up to speed. In this video, we will see how to create a config client which can consume information from the config server. We will be using a previous Spring Boot project we had created, Spring Boot and JPA, working with table with composite PK in service methods and form submissions. I wanted to show you how easy it is to switch from a local property file to a Spring config server for an app to get its properties. Here I have Spring Tool Suite running, which is a flavor of Eclipse. Here is the Spring config server project we had built in our earlier video. Let's open its application.properties file. This config server is looking at a GitHub URL as a source of its property files. Keeping the property files in GitHub makes it easy for us to change them without having to bounce any app. The config server automatically reads the change or additions. So here is the GitHub URL where it is pointing to. We have a couple of apps here, My App and My App Second. There is also a default application.properties file here. Clicking on My App, we see there are two property files here, one for the dev profile as it has -dev appended to it. It has some common properties like the data source properties, etc. And for demonstration, I have added a key location which has a value My App Dev Profile. So we go to the browser and type http localhost 8888 where the config server is listening and followed by our app name and then / the profile. We see the config server resolves it nicely with the specific property file for the dev profile first, followed by the one for the app myapp.properties, and finally followed by the application.properties. So there is a nice hierarchy it resolves to. Now let's go to our Spring Boot project which we had built earlier in my video, Spring Boot and JPA, working with table with composite PK in service methods and form submissions. Let's open the application.properties file. Let's say we will have several instances of this service running and we do not want to have these properties inside the application, but would like this microservice to access it from a central source of the config server. Let's see how to do that. As you can see, there are a bunch of properties here pointing to the database, connection pool properties, logging, server port, etc. Let's launch this app. Go to the main class, and here we have a command line runner which runs as soon as the application is launched. Here it is connected to a database. It inserts a person and then retrieves and prints the person information. So the database connectivity is working fine. Let's go back to our application.properties file. Let's copy all these properties, go to GitHub and to our repository. Let's click Create New File to create a property file for our app. Name it our application name.properties. So composite pk.properties. Let's paste our properties here. Comment the changes. Let's see if we can access this through the config server. So config server URL followed by our app name composite pk followed by the profile name default. And yes, it can access it just fine. Now back to our app. Let us delete the properties from here, save the file. Let's relaunch our app. And as expected, it fails to start as it cannot find the database properties for it to tie into a database. Now to make our app refer to the config server, first we have to include a few dependencies. So let's open the Maven file, add a couple of dependencies, one for the SpringCloud config client and the other for actuator. Let us go to source main resources and create a new file, bootstrap.properties. Let us put a few properties in here mentioning our active profile name, the URL for the config server, and our application name so that the config client can get the right properties from the config server. We did not put them in the application.properties file. Bootstrap.properties file is read before Spring starts configuring beans, and we wanted to read these right at the startup, then versus putting them in application.properties file, which it reads much later, and by then it's too late. That is it. Now on startup, the app will be able to read the configuration file, see the database properties, logging settings, etc., and configure data source, etc. automatically. To demonstrate that it is able to read the properties from the config server just fine, let's go to our main class, and using the value annotation, let's get a value. Let's pick a key to show. So go to GitHub, open our apps property file. Let's pick the data source username, put it in the value annotation with the $sign and within curly braces. Declare a variable string username which will hold the value. Put that as a part of the system out. Let's relaunch our app, and here in the output we see that it was able to do the database insert and fetch operations, so the database was read and wired correctly from the config server, as well as the username demo, which it was able to read properly from the property file. In this video, we saw how the config server provides a central source of configuration for properties. We converted our application to use the config server by using the SpringCloud config client dependency, added a property file for the app to GitHub, and then demonstrated that it was able to contact the config server and work seamlessly. Thanks for watching.